Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm Amanda Anguish, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist.
And we are going to jump in to hot water today because we are going to talk about something that some of you are going to not be too happy with, and others of you are going to love us, and you're probably going to want to share this with somebody you know who's dealing with this. But we are going to talk about psychedelics today. So my first question is, tell us, what are we talking about in terms of psychedelics? Because this is a big can of worms we're opening up. So what's in the can of worms?
It's a great question. So when we think about psychedelics, we're thinking about a wide variety of molecules that essentially change the way that people view the reality right now. So that would what would fall under that umbrella? Well, it would be things like LSD is your classic psychedelic, but also mushrooms, psilocybin. Ecstasy is also included in that. Ibogaine, mescaline, and even ketamine is considered a psychedelic as well.
I've heard that. Well, I've heard all of those, but some of those are more popular today than maybe some of the other ones. But this seems to be, a lot of people are using it. Maybe you can share with us a little bit about the history of this, because I've been hearing about some of these for a really long time, and they kind of have their fad era, and then another one pops up. So you want to share with us the history?
Yeah, so psychedelics, have been around for thousands of years as far as in a plant form. But when they really came onto the scene, so to speak, in more mainstream society, it was after LSD was synthesized. And so in 1938, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD actually from a fungus. And
what does that mean to synthesize something, by the way? That might be helpful.
Essentially, he isolated the molecule out of the fungus, and so then he was able to study it in isolation. And so he kind of put it on the shelf for a few years. But in 1943, for some reason, and no one's really sure why, he had what he called a peculiar presentiment that he should look at LSD again. And so he of course looked at it again, and he said he liked the chemical structure, typical scientist, I guess. and
it was attractive to him.
Right. And he accidentally ingested a very small quantity.
I think I've heard that line before. I accidentally.
Right. Yeah. You wonder about that, right? But supposedly he accidentally ingested a very small quantity, and before he knew it, he was completely out of his mind and in a whole new world.
Okay.
And then it took time, but over time, so he started studying more into it, and then other scientists did as well. And eventually it made its way more and more into America. And then, of course, we all are familiar with the 1960s and 70s, and this is really where LSD and psychedelics came more into the cultural revolution that was going on at that time. Eventually, of course, it was outlawed by the United States government. I believe that was in 1968, but it still became something that a lot of people were experimenting with, and they were doing research wondering if this could actually help mental disorders like autism or schizophrenia, this sort of thing. And they weren't really finding much help, and so eventually it kind of people lost interest. And sure, there was still people that were doing drugs that were doing it, but the scientific community, there wasn't really much research going on after the 1970s.
So I'm curious, why did the United States outlaw it?
Yeah, well, they
Because it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal now. It seems like everybody's getting on the train.
right. So back then, there was thinking that if this became normalized and if people were allowed to use it without, restriction, then it could essentially make our society break down. And a lot of people thought that this was very much related to that revolution that was happening in our culture, and that essentially it would lead to the demise of a well-ordered culture.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
That's right. And so the fear of that then led to it being outlawed.
Oh, okay. But they still decided to keep studying it and
Well, that's an
using
interesting
it.
thing. Yeah. So, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were some scientists that actually started to get interested in it again. And if you look at the history, a lot of it ends up being related to these individuals having their own personal experiences with the psychedelics, and in a lot of them, it seems like they were in not so good place in their own lives, and so they decided, okay, well, let me maybe try something new, something different
And
for
this
my own
isn't
life
just LSD,
personally.
this is other things too.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So some of them maybe tried mushrooms, some of them maybe LSD. So again, this is kind of a class of drugs, if you will. And so some of these researchers then, or scientists, had experiences themselves or knew people that had experiences, and they said, maybe we should take a look at this again, because it seems like it actually brings people into a different sort of mental state that could maybe be helpful. And isn't that what we're kind of trying to do with like the the pharmaceutical industry, right? Where like with antidepressants and stuff, we're trying to change the way people think. So if these drugs could potentially alter someone's state of consciousness and help them shift into a different way of thinking and feeling, maybe there could be some utility in helping people get over mental health issues.
That's such a human condition that you talked about, that they were looking for something.
Yeah.
They were looking for something. We're all looking for something, whether or not we find the right thing, but they were looking for something. And I wonder what they were looking for or
Well,
why they were
yeah.
looking for it. You said they had a lot of experience with it themselves. They might have been in a not so great place, and so they're experimenting.
Exactly, and so they weren't finding maybe satisfaction in their own personal lives, or maybe they were seeing other people or situations where just their way of doing things, whether it was psychiatric medications or whatever lifestyle habits and choices, it wasn't working out. So then you start looking for other options, right? And so what's interesting is that we've seen a huge renaissance in the research over recent years. So over the last 2 decades, if you look at a graph of the number of publications that have come out, or scientific publications related to psychiatric research, you just see this huge spike in the number of publications that have come out, because there's just been a ton of research, especially as the excitement has grown and as this culture of normalizing psychedelic use has grown, and people just really saying, wow, this really has changed my life, and it has brought me into a new and deeper understanding, and I feel so much better. And they have a lot of momentum moving forward. Now we're to the point where pretty soon, we can expect to have a full FDA approval of some of these substances, like MDMA specifically, and psilocybin, in other words, the magic mushrooms, for particular illnesses, mental health illnesses.
So I'm curious, who's paying for all this research to be done? Because that's expensive to do. And I don't think a bunch of people left over from the 60s and 70s are just pooling their money together to pay for this. So we're like, why this resurgence in the research and all these articles and stuff coming up about it?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, even in the Wall Street Journal, this is an article published in February of 2023. It says Wall Street backs new class of psychedelic drugs. Now, if you think that Wall Street is behind something, why would they be behind something if there wasn't going to be, unless there was a huge amount of money?
Cha-ching.
Yes. And so that's what it is. Investors are looking at it and they're seeing, some of this data. And of course, the early research was probably funded by, a few people pooling money or maybe some interested universities or what have you. But then once you get a certain amount of positive results, then investors
people just like it and
right.
use it.
Investors start looking at that and they say, okay, well, there's money here. And so then you're going to get more research dollars that are poured into that.
So in terms of like, what are the results of these things, like the reality of it? And I'm thinking the research, are they looking at the downsides of it, or are they just looking at the upsides of it?
Well,
because we know about this from experiencing, seeing people use these things, but in our cases, they don't seem to be getting better.
Yes, and that is one of the downsides. But I will say that the research, and this is where we're seeing some of those positive results in the research, is that for MDMA, for example, that a lot of people that have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, and MDMA has been studied a lot for that, and it seems like a lot of people actually do make significant headway much quicker than they normally would with these psychotherapy sessions where they use MDMA. Ecstasy is the other name for that, beforehand. And it seems to facilitate this sense, because they'll process, what happened with the therapist, but then because of the drug and the positive feelings that they get with the oxytocin and the dopamine and the serotonin being released in their brain, now they've been exposed to that experience, but they're not feeling so afraid of it anymore. And so...
not afraid of the therapy session or talking about it?
Maybe some of both. About the traumatic experience. And so also with psilocybin, the big things that they're looked at there are with depression, with also end of life, existential sort of situations, and then addiction. And then with ketamine, we actually have what we would call an enantiomer, or a very related compound, which is S-ketamine. So it's like a molecule that's very related to ketamine, and that has actually been FDA approved already for depression. That one is not as strong of a psychedelic, but it's still considered a psychedelic drug. But you're absolutely right. There are also downsides too that we often ignore. And those are some of the things that I think we need to really be careful and actually talk about, so that we don't just get sucked in and say, oh, this is great. It makes me feel better. And so therefore I should advise it to, my friends, and I should do it myself, and everyone should get psychedelics.
Yeah, I'm thinking this is a lot like what I hear people say in terms of, even drinking or something. They say, oh, it's good for my heart, and oh, it's got resveratrol and it's good for my skin. But then they don't realize, well, it exponentially increases my risk of cancer. So how much am I going to care how good I look if I'm 6 feet under in a casket, sort of thing? And I'm not saying everybody dies of cancer, but if you're putting yourself in that situation. So it sounds like there are some benefits, but what is the bigger picture of this?
That's it. And we always have to look, when we make any choice in life, we have to look at the potential benefits, but we also have to very carefully look at the risks. And
I think that's important too, because what some people don't realize when they read research is they're only getting one side of the research, or they're only focusing on one aspect of the research. The research hasn't been conclusive in terms of, we looked at everything about this. We're only focusing on this one element, and then they put it out in the news and everybody goes, oh, it's great for me, like jump on the bandwagon, not realizing, well, they didn't study the other downsides of it too, or they didn't include that ultimately in the news article. And so maybe you can share some of Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about how they all work, or like what are psychedelics doing to us when we say, "Oh, it made me feel better," or I didn't have to, feel so scared talking about my traumatic experience.
Right. So that's a great question. They all have somewhat unique mechanisms of action, but one particular thing that I think is common to all of them that makes them psychedelics is that they affect what we call the default mode network. And so I think it's important to review what the default mode network is, because many of our listeners may not be so familiar with that.
That has to do with the brain.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And so the default mode network is where we go when our minds wander. In other words, when we daydream, when we ruminate, when we reflect on ourselves or even worry. So, in other words, it's the part of the brain that is active when we're not proactively concentrated on anything in particular. It's kind of when our brain is a little bit neutral. And so when the default mode network is active, then this is really what a lot of people call the me network, because really it has to do with what we think about and in our perspective of who we are. And
It's the
also,
passive part of the brain, like where we tend to go or something.
yeah,
Maybe?
so exactly. So it just involves like those neural networks in our brain that are active when we're, again, not in a concentrated state. We're just kind of in this more passive daydreaming type state, okay, or a self-reflective state perhaps, because it has a lot to do, and this is why they call it the me network, with our sense of who we are. Okay, so this is the part of the brain that's activated when we think about like, who am I? Okay, and also it has to do with our picture of the world, our outlook, and other people as well. It also has a lot to do with moral reasoning, with social evaluations and judging social concepts. Okay, so again, that's the whole aspect of how we view others and how we view the world. And so what it does is it really exerts kind of this, what we call top-down influence on other parts of the brain. And so it's almost becomes a bit of a corporate executive or orchestra conductor that holds the whole system together. So we think about, of course, the frontal lobe, which is like the logical part of the brain, but the default mode network really helps to even orchestrate, even on a higher level, if you will, the connections between like the logical part of your brain and your emotions, and how you finally come to like decisions and judgments and concepts about myself and the world and all of this. And so
It's interesting that you said, and I know you just agreed with me, but when you said passive, but then you say it's the conductor too, which I know those don't have to be opposing, but does that mean that on the one hand, it's the default where I naturally go to, but I've developed that default to some degree to take over? It's kind of like the battery backup.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. So it's just it really defines a lot of who we are and what our, and you're right. Over time that is going to change and shift depending on the day-to-day choices we make. That actually, and what we think about and what we view and all of this affects the development of the default mode network. And so, again, it really kind of composes the story of who we are, if we will. And so the interesting thing is, of course, if with psychedelics, what the psychedelics do is they will suppress the function of the default mode network. And this is why when people are on a psychedelic drug, they will have a sense of a loss of a sense of self. And a lot of people, when they go to what we call ego dissolution, in other words, where you have that sense of being just connected with the universe, this is when the psychedelic drug is kicking in and often peaking, is when the default mode network is basically dropping down to very low activity, and you start to lose that sense of I am an individual person, and instead you start feeling connected with the whole universe, with the flowers, the trees, the earth, and you forget that you are even an individual at all, and you're just one with everything and with everyone. And this is also the part, so because the default mode network helps to keep your brain organized and working in a synchronized fashion, when that is shut down, now there's parts of your brain that talk to each other that normally never talk to each other. So what that means is that you might not only have new like weird ideas that you've never thought of before, but you also might even hear color or see sound, because there's different parts of your brains that are talking to each other. So your brain will interpret sensory stimuli in a very strange way. And this is why people see like tracers and have these hallucinations and all of this, because there's different parts of the brain talking to each other that normally would never talk to each other as that default mode network is being shut down.
Wow. There's so many connotations to this that I mean, where do I even start?
I know, right?
But so you're outside of yourself. So in a sense, you're disconnected from yourself. And then I wonder if this is, a lot of people say, oh, I just want to be free.
Yes.
Is there something about our default mode that if we're not in tune with our values and stuff, that makes us want to be away from that and not have to deal with it, like if we have a dissonant life or something?
Absolutely. And this is where people, because the point of the reason, so let's just backtrack one minute here. If you think about with psychedelics and the effect they have on depression, for example, if someone is depressed, then you're in this default mode of ruminating on negativity and all these things that are wrong with me, and I'm such a terrible person. Look at all these mistakes I've made in the past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now, of course, you don't like feeling that way. So what do you want to do? You want to alter your state of consciousness. You want to alter that feeling so that you can actually feel better, because we don't like pain as human beings.
I don't want to deal with things I've done.
Depression is painful, right? Now, of course, there's a significant amount of depression where there's inappropriate guilt, et cetera. But there's also often things where if we're depressed or we're having mental health problems, some of that rumination can be healthy and helpful in that if it's appropriate guilt, for example.
I call it the difference between episodic depression, like a feeling of depression, versus a pervasive diagnosis of depression. And episodic might be appropriate if I've done something wrong and I need to make, amends or do something, conflict resolution, whatever that is. And if I want to distance myself from that, what am I actually doing?
Yeah.
I'm not solving the problem. I'm leaving it over here to fester and mold. And
that's right.
So,
but here's a shortcut. If you have if there's something you need to change and you're feeling depressed about it, but you really don't want to change it, and like you said, maybe you're malaligned because of some of the choices. These are kind of the values that you've been taught and that you actually believe, but then you made some choices that are not aligned with that. But you don't want to really change. So now here's a shortcut where you can alter your conscious state, feel better, and not have to really do the hard work of change. And actually, one of the main researchers on psychological or psychedelics, I just want to read this quote. It's very interesting because he compares it with SSRIs, and he contrasts actually this serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the antidepressants. He says, this is from Carhart Harris. He's one of the main researchers, and he says, while SSRIs dampen emotional depth by reducing the responsiveness of the brain's stress circuitry, helping to take the edge off depressive symptoms, psilocybin seems to liberate thought and feeling. It does this by dysregulating the most evolutionary developed aspect of our brain, the neocortex. When this liberation occurs alongside professional psychological support, the most common outcome is a renewed breadth of perspective. Psychedelic therapy seems to catalyze a type of psychological growth that is conductive or conducive to mental health, overlapping in many respects with spiritual growth.
Oh, there's something else we can talk about too.
So basically, what we see is that psychedelics have a huge element of changing the way that we view reality. And what's interesting is that it actually does this by disorganizing and causing more entropy in the brain. So it actually disorganizes brain activity so that essentially we can come into a new reality, a new way of being. And again, this is why a lot of people find like, oh, this actually shocked me out of my depression because now I view myself and the world differently because essentially my default mode network has been reset. It's kind of like hitting that reset button or turning the power off on your computer and rebooting it and hoping that it comes back and it's fixed.
Well, the question now is that new reality accurate, or is it a false reality, or what's going on? Because there's one reality typically, and
that is a great question.
Is it a parallel reality? Like, how does that work?
Yes, and it's fascinating to me too, because we actually see a lot of parallels even with Eastern meditation, where people, some of the most experienced meditators will literally get to a dissociative state where they, and also when it comes to the default mode network, when some of these meditators, very experienced ones, it will start to shut down and they have this feeling of being one with the universe, one with everybody or everything else around them, et cetera, et cetera. And the goal of meditation, this type of meditation that we're talking about, is very similar to psychedelic therapy in creating a new state of consciousness, a new state of reality. But again, like you said, is that actually real reality, or is that just really a fake reality that I've kind of wanted to make, but it's not rooted in real reality?
And how hard is it if I create or I go to a new reality, if I have to come back to the other reality at some point when, say, my mom wants me to come over and visit her, like, how do I exit this state to go to that place? And will I be really frustrated and discouraged having to keep coming back and using more to go back to that reality, because it doesn't last forever, right?
That's right. And it can be relatively annoying when other people are not playing by the rules of your new reality.
They're not in the same new reality that you're in. And then if a bunch of people are in a reality, are they even all in the same reality?
Yeah. And
this is going too many.
No, and it's enough to drive anybody crazy just thinking about it, right? Because then now suddenly we have to play by all these different realities. And anyway, the point being, though, I've worked with people that have done psychedelics for mental health. And so what's been interesting just to kind of observe from an outside perspective is that many of these people have said, you know what, it seemed like it really shifted me out of a dark place. It changed things dramatically. But then they've also often added that over time, especially if they did this multiple times, that they started feeling less and less connected to reality, and they started feeling more and more dissociated, like, which is this state of kind of feeling disconnected from reality, even from their themselves, et cetera, in the day-to-day existence. And so it's interesting because I think that's kind of hard to quantify and to even list on maybe a side effect profile of some of these.
Yeah, how do you put that in a side effect?
Exactly, but this is part of the problem. I think over time, people are actually going to, and the more we see people using psychedelics, people are going to be less and less rooted in reality and more living in kind of their pseudo-reality. And again, maybe even more frustrated with reality or trying to force like their pseudo-reality into being their genuine reality by only surrounding themselves with people that perhaps fully agree with their perspective on, the way they want things to be, or maybe isolating themselves from most everybody, and kind of creating this world that they think is the right world for them to live in.
This is so powerful because we see this in other things too, very basic, like years ago when I started working with, young people even, and they'd get into video games, and they'd live in that world. Like they're very realistic to them. They had friends in that world. And then their parents would try to get them out of that addiction because they were spending hours and like tens of hours a day on it. And then they would be so depressed if you took that away from them. And I'm thinking the same ramifications for this is, what if I'm doing this, but I have to come back to this reality? How hard is it when I've developed tools and strategies to deal with that reality or to work in that reality, but then I have to come back to this reality and I have no tools anymore because I haven't built up that. Because the more we go through life, the more we're developing tools to handle things. But if I'm not doing that in reality and in an alternative reality, then what do I have coming back to reality?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a big problem. And I think we're kind of seeing more and more of that, like you said, not just with psychedelics, but multiple areas of society. And I think
even movies.
Yes.
I noticed there's been a trend, even if I don't watch them, you could still hear about them. All this trend of alternative reality theme, we're being primed to accept that there's an alternative reality.
That's right. And I think it really is dangerous in so many ways that we could go on and on about. But one interesting thing I wanted to mention too, when you talk about kind of that altering of the reality state, a lot of people that go through psychedelic therapy, they experience one of two things. Not everybody, but a lot of people, either a sense of being born again or of giving birth. And so it's a very interesting dynamic. Again, it's like this fresh start, this resetting process. And I think in my mind, it totally reminds me of what God does want us to experience in reality. In other words, he wants us in the only reality that truly exists, which is his reality, the one that he's created, to be born again, to become new people, to have a fresh start, but to do it in the context of his principles and living aligned with his values, because that's ultimately going to bring us the most genuine happiness and true connection, not just a pseudo feeling of connection. And
Satan can't create anything, he can only counterfeit
that's it. And to me, that's one of the most dangerous elements of all of this. Is I think a lot of the big reason why we're having a renaissance in psychedelic therapy and research is because our society and our world, for that matter, is becoming more and more destitute of true healthy spirituality, of truly following God and his way of doing things.
They're craving, essentially.
That's right. Exactly. And so then we have to turn to other ways of filling that void, because we are saying, look, I need spirituality. I need that sense of connection with a higher power, with maybe, others and with God and that sort of thing. But I'm not willing to really do it following God's recipe, because that's going to step on my toes and goes against what I want to do. So now here's a wonderful way.
I'm thirsty, I need water, but I want dirt.
That's right.
I don't want water, I want dirt. And I want dirt to do the thing that water's supposed to do.
And so here's a wonderful, quote unquote, wonderful way where I can still do what I want and still have that void filled. The problem is, again, it's pseudo reality, it's pseudo connection, it's pseudo happiness, and it doesn't really.
And it's total empty and inconsistent. It's not consistent.
Right. That's right.
Wow.
So, and this is why I think that even if these things get us to feeling better, we want to ask ourselves, at what cost? Is the cost really worth it? Are we, eating pig's food and we're expecting that to keep us healthy? And God has really given us this beautiful feast that will truly make us healthy and happy.
I think this is a good time to reflect on anything in our lives that's pseudo.
Yeah.
pseudo the real thing?
Yeah.
And it could be food. Am I eating junk food to replace like the nutrients that my body really craves and needs? Is it, connection, and I'm going to pseudo connections? But especially as we talk about psychedelics, I mean, just a huge emphasis on what is this? When I crave these things or I want this thing, what do I really need? I need a connection with God, and I need the reality that He offers, which is true reality versus this pseudo reality.
That's right. And the interesting thing is there are healthy ways to change our default mode network. But the problem is, at least a lot of people view it as a problem. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a great thing. It takes hard work for the most part, right? So some of the things that
4-letter word.
yes. But in the long run, this work also makes us happy.
It also takes humility.
Yeah, it does.
It takes an awareness that, maybe I can't do everything on my own way. There are certain ways that I was made to work, just like my car, and I can't do it the way I want to do it. I have to accept the way it works.
Yep. That's exactly right. And I'll just mention a couple of those that require work and are, like you said, in harmony with the owner's manual and what God made us to be and how He made us to work. So things like physical activity, exercise, this. And again, these aren't going to be as drastic as like taking a psychedelic, but over time, incrementally, these things will change default mode network to a better state. So exercise.
They won't have the side effects, though, either.
Yeah, the side effects will be getting stronger.
Good side effects.
Yes.
No withdrawals.
Attention training techniques, cognitive behavioral therapy, which I know is one of your favorites, right? Interestingly, sleep deprivation. So this is why, and I'm not suggesting that people would regularly do this, but once in a while, if people are stuck in a severe depression, sometimes we'll even have people try sleep deprivation for a night or something like that. And it can actually help to reset the default mode network. But also good, healthy sleep helps too. So especially what we call
certain times.
Yes, N3 sleep, which is the deepest stage of sleep, helps to reset the default mode network in a healthier direction.
Isn't that the time before midnight too?
Yes, it is. And so you want to get that sleep before midnight. And then meditation and prayer. And
true meditation.
Yes, healthy meditation and experiences of awe in nature will also cause positive default mode network change.
Take a trip to a national park. That'll create awe.
Yes, exactly. So there's good ways to do it. But again, we're looking for those shortcuts. One other, just maybe a couple other things to take note of as far as the dangers of psychedelics, especially from a spiritual standpoint, is that number one, a lot of people, when they go through this supernatural trip this psychedelic trip, I'll say, is that they have experiences with quote unquote connecting with the dead. It's a very common thing that happens, and actually people that are kind of guided, they call them guides that will guide you through these psychedelic experiences, are often very connected with the world, the underworld, so to speak. Spiritualistic, non-biblical
witches, druids, all kinds
practices.
Of things.
And so again, you're starting to think like, wow, so there's a lot of spiritual stuff that comes into all of this. This isn't just chemistry, And it's very fascinating too, because I think this even gives us a clue, this whole experience, and this is the second thing I wanted to mention. It gives us a clue on why people have these after-death experiences. Because what's interesting, again, when you, so some people have these near-death experiences, or maybe they were even pronounced dead, but then they come back to life, and then they say, I know for sure that after you die, your spirit and your soul continues to live because I saw myself on that operating table or whatever it is. And I was able to I came out of my body and I was, in a different state and I was going to some celestial state or something like this. I don't think that actually has anything to do with truly a conscious spirit leaving the body. Actually, the Bible says the dead do not know anything,
Yeah.
right? In fact, what is happening there is that default mode network, when someone is about to die or essentially is clinically dead, is shutting down. And so again, you experience that ego dissolution, that loss of that sense of self, and you can feel like you're leaving your body, and you have this different perspective, and you can hallucinate and all of this. And then, as you come back to life, of course, you enter back into your body, but it's not really a conscious spirit coming back in. It's just that your default mode network is actually coming back online.
I don't think I told you this, but I had my wisdom teeth out and I passed out in the middle of having the surgery, and I literally thought I was dying.
Wow.
It wasn't like, oh, I'm just shutting down sort of thing. It was kind of psychedelic experience where it was like those cartoons that have the psychedelic thing and you see things coming at you and going out. I do have to say I was under the influence of pain medication.
Right. Yeah.
But I remember coming back and thinking, why didn't they hear what I was saying? They were trying to wake me up because I literally passed out from the pain. And I thought I was speaking to them, and they didn't hear me because I wasn't actually speaking to them. I was just responding with
internally.
The very little awareness that I had in the midst of it.
Yeah, so that's a great example of how, our brain will trick us into having a experience that we think is conscious, but is actually not a real experience. It's just one where our brain is making connections and we're experiencing sensations that are not actually what's truly happening. And so again, there's so much to say about this topic, but I really want our listeners to understand that yes, we are seeing a lot of the media and the propaganda saying psychedelics, wow, this is a great way to get a quick fix. But we have to be extremely careful and really weigh that potential risk of how is this going to affect me in the long term? Am I going to become an individual that's more dissociated? Am I going to become like less rooted in reality and more in my pseudo reality? Am I going to actually sacrifice my eternal well-being, my healthy spiritual relationship with God so that I can feel better temporarily? And I would say it's not worth it.
Yeah, and am I willing to be responsible to myself in terms of humility and being present, because I miss out on connection too. That's pulling you away from so much.
That's right.
Wow, this I feel like we've packed a lot into a little bit that's kind of like a really concentrated appetizer that I hope all of our listeners will take this and start asking themselves questions, even if you're not doing psychedelics, but in other areas of their lives too, but especially as they hear things about psychedelics, to really take that and understand that it's not just what we're hearing, that there's so much more to it, and do the costs outweigh the benefits of it?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening. This has been a big topic that we've tried to fit into a short time, and we hope you'll take some things away from this. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.